Eldon Bleak, a hedge wizard, formerly known by the criminals of the city as One Trick, had become a reliable if unlikely source of information since his arrest a few months previous. After being the only member of a group which robbed a local magistrate's summer home to be apprehended, he had quickly entered into negotiations. "I am a bit of a sorcerer," he had announced from the darkness of his jail cell as lightning flashed across the storming night sky outside. "Is that right?" Patrick had commented absently as by lamplight he studied his next move of the small gray monolith-like pieces across the wooden game board on the table between us. "You know, I think I knew that already," he chuckled. "He's the one they call One Trick," I added, as I gazed across the page of my favorite newspaper, only halfway paying attention to the game, as Patrick was notorious for taking vast quantities of time in contemplating his strategy when playing stones. "They say he really only does one spell very well." I gave the young man seated on the bench behind the bars a sideways glance. He was very small and thin, with a shock of prematurely white hair, which hinted at a northern heritage. "That's right," Patrick agreed, scratching the thin auburn beard on his chin. "Which spell is that, Mr. Bleak?" he asked without looking from the board, but the smile betraying his intention. "Oh, I think you both know what it is," the young man sighed wistfully as he cleaned the rain from his small, round glasses on his green plaid waistcoat. "Yeah, that's right," Patrick announced with mock realization. "You can cast a spell which opens locks." "He casts it right well," I acknowledged as I gestured to the front page of my paper, which featured a story about the recent robberies throughout the city. The cage man groaned as he ran his long, thin fingers through his wet hair. I can do other things," he offered, but the crack in his voice betrayed his lack of esteem. I can do a pretty decent healing charm. I was originally studying to be a doctor not long ago." This actually caught Patrick's attention, and he turned on the wooden stool to face the criminal directly. "Really?" he expounded with raised eyebrows. "Well, you don't have to sound so astonished," he sighed, lowering his head dismally. "Sorry, mate, but you understand why, don't you?" I continued to act as if I was reading, but at this point was completely focused on what promised to be one of Patrick's legendary interrogations. He was a master of guiding idle conversations through layers of mundanity, only to arrive with complete, unwitting confessions and helpful information by the end. Yes, because here I am, a common criminal sitting in jail awaiting my fate. But it's not as if I intended things to go this direction. I had plans, goals that changed from as far as crime as anyone could imagine. I grew up in a decent foster home, with decent adopted parents. I had every intention of going to school and becoming a man of science. I studied the young man's clear, ice-blue eyes, and noted that even though I heard emotion in his voice, I could not see it on his face, as was common with the people of the Northfolk blood. I noted that he himself might be influencing us to attain some nefarious outcome. "So what happened, Mr. Bleak?" Pat said casually as he crossed his arms with the impression he intended to give the matter his full consideration, even though I knew him no fool to be easily swayed. "A couple of things," the man coughed as if embarrassed. "Was it a girl?" I offered as he shook his head. "Was it a boy?" Patrick followed, but the gutter mage continued with the same reaction. "Some temptation of a dangerous young rogue luring you into a dark underworld with their sultry wiles?" No, nothing like that." His mannerisms gave no inclination of dishonesty or subterfuge. "I'm not a person who is inclined to become enwrapped in the matters of the heart. In truth, I have no particular affinity for relationships of any kind. My weakness is one of another variety altogether. It began as simply just being distracted from my studies. I found myself at the library, hunting old texts of Arcana and the occult instead of memorizing anatomy and biology. I had never had access to such information at home. Finding so much so easily available was intoxicating. There were entire tomes devoted to the practices of the moon priests and the ancient histories of the fairy folk out west. Tales from the lands of stone and treatises on the demonology of the Hulda folk. Then, as if I was not already becoming distracted, I discovered alchemy and actual rituals, ceremonies and spells. Many were well past my comprehension, but there were a few which I had begun to practice with enthusiasm. Like opening locks, Patrick said, shaking his head with mock disappointment. Yes, like that one. But still, I would never have thought of using such charms for illegal activities until I stumbled across my next big preoccupation. Which was, I asked, folding my paper down for a moment as if I were just now becoming interested. Cards, Patrick almost shouted as he clapped his hands in victory. That's it, isn't it? That was my next guess. Bleak did not respond, but merely lowered his head into his hands in defeat. I'm right, aren't I? You started gambling. Perhaps, came a muffled moan from the darkness. He then sat up straight and held out his hands in explanation. I had no idea that games of chance could be so exhilarating. Every time I won, it was as if my soul was alight with excitement. And when you lost, abysmal. But seemingly worth it to my troubled gambler mind. I just kept going back to the table over and over. And when your money was spent, I began taking small loans. From criminals, of course. Yes, quite dangerous ones at that, as it turned out. So you had to pay off your debt. I did. So you started helping them in robberies. Bleak paused thoughtfully for a time. You know, when I first came to this city, I thought I was actually kind of intelligent. And now, Patrick asked, with what was unmistakable sympathy, real or created, of which one I could not tell. A fool, a terrible fool, who is in so much trouble it is unfathomable to me. Oh, I think you can fathom it, Mr. Bleak. You just may not want to accept it. Will I be hung? He croaked, but neither of us answered. Oh, dear sweet spirits, please don't hang me. Would you rather be imprisoned? Patrick spoke solemnly. No, not at all. I would much rather do neither. There are very few bad options for you, but it will not be left to your choice. Would you offer the names of those you are helping? They would know and kill me. Probably, but perhaps you could run and hide. I don't really see that as a viable option either. They do horrible things to informants. Yes, they do. But you have only horrible options now. There has to be some other way. He was now standing with his hands grasping the bars of the cell. Patrick turned and looked at me, and I refused to meet his gaze. How many people actually know that you guys have nicked me? He asked in a most reasonable, business-like tone. And what does that matter? Patrick returned to stare to the prisoner. I mean, if I were to somehow leave here right now, how many people would know? How much trouble would you be in? There was no glib smile or clever looks. Bleak was speaking with the utmost seriousness. It doesn't matter, Mr. Bleak, because you're not going anywhere, I answered. Humor me, gentlemen. If I were to somehow vanish, would you fellows end up in all kinds of trouble? As late as it was when we brought you in, no one has been notified yet. The sergeant won't be here until morning," Patrick said with a sad smile, as if telling sad news to a child. "But like my partner said, Mr. Bleak, we are not letting you go unless you have a tremendous card you have not yet played. You haven't even offered us any information on the others in your group." Yes, gentlemen. But just to be specific, you two are the only authorities to be involved in my arrest." His eyes darted from Patrick to me, and I began to feel a certain creeping suspicion. Was there some way he was going to actually negotiate his release? "Give us something, Mr. Bleak. Work with us. Who's the boss of the robberies? Who's running the show? I mean, yes, we are the only ones who know of your capture at this moment, but there is no reason we would consider letting you go." Patrick held out his hands and pled the case like a barrister. "But there is a reason." Bleak's voice was calm, steady, and somewhat compelling, despite me knowing he was obviously trying to manipulate us. "And what is that?" Patrick once more folded his arms and leaned back in his convince me pose. "You are both so tired." I hadn't realized it, but he was making small gestures with his long hands through the bars towards us. I found the smooth movements very pleasing to behold, and I watched with fascination. "What are you talking about? I'm wide awake," Patrick stated, with a sudden, inexplicable yawn. "It is quite obvious to me, gentlemen, that you are both exhausted and are in dire, absolute need of some very deep, impenetrable slumber. Why, you can barely keep your eyes open, so completely and utterly drowsy you are." I was watching the amazing, fluid motions of his hands as his fingers traced invisible images in the air before us, and gradually I began to feel as if I could almost see the vague, violet, glowing outline of shapes and designs and runes flowing from his movements. "I want you both to know that I truly respect both of you, and was really quite impressed with the genuine amount of respect and kindness you showed me. I have found you both to be outstanding examples of high moral citizenship, and I would feel terrible if I caused you to suffer any harm or punishment when you have both been capital fellows. You must realize, though, that I cannot in good faith trade the identities of my fellow thieves either, and I definitely can't allow myself to be executed or imprisoned if there is anything I can do to prevent it, which is why I've been practicing another skill religiously for weeks. Both of you should rest now and enjoy a lovely, restful bit of sleep." Which was the last thing I remembered, as he practically purred the syllables like some great white-haired and silver-eyed cat. Eldon escaped. We awoke only when we heard the sound of our co-workers entering in the morning. I cannot describe the feeling as our eyes met and we exchanged a lingering look of both shame and acceptance. Neither of us had truly desired to see the young man imprisoned or executed, and although we felt the fools, we still said nothing to the others. However, as we went home in the growing morning light, we had already realized that it was only a matter of time before we caught him again. We began watching the gambling houses and library equally, and it was only a brief period before he was spotted again. While we continued our surveillance, we discussed how we wished to handle this situation. We watched him carefully to see if he was interacting with any of the known thieves, but seemingly he kept to himself. However, The following week, a local gang leader was found dead in an alley with a few of his cronies. We didn't realize it at the time, but that was just the beginning, as crime bosses from various levels of the local competing thieves guilds would hound butchered in a most spectacular way, often completely disemboweled, with their flesh ripped from their bodies. These first three, however, stood out, as they were rumored to be the group whom which Eldon Bleak had been involved. Standing there in that alley, Investigator Fell angrily shouted at other militia to keep the growing horde of reporters at bay while he attempted to study the crime scene. "Keep 'em back!" The giant man, who looked like a great bear stuffed into a waistcoat and wearing a bowler hat, shook his great mechanical steel fist at the barricade. "I want a decent picture with the new camera before those wretched animals get over here and turn it into 10 headlines. The photographer was invisible beneath the curtain of his box, but for the great flash pan exploding like a blue-white star in the cold, damp air of the early, dark morning. He looked at us, just as we had pushed through the line, and I felt the great metal snap of his grip on my collar, pulling me forward and loudly whispering, "'Twas them that was robbing the shops and warehouses, Till. I know it was. I'd been watching them for weeks." These were the crimes that we had associated with Eldon. "Did you ever get anywhere with that bloke? They call him One Trick." Patrick had been coughing uncomfortably as if he was suddenly struck by hay fever. "No, sir, I interjected with a glare at Pat. "That's a shame, 'cause this whole scene reeks of damned magic." He gestured in a wide swath over the area with his normal, flesh-covered hand, but his eyes were locked on the bloody heap laying at the base of the alley wall. "Why do you say that, sir?" Patrick suddenly cured his fit of coughing and locked his gaze on Fell. "Can you not see what has done here? That man looks as if he were thrown in the air against that wall, had his guts ripped from his belly, and then his skin peeled off like a ripe orange. The other two, almost identical wounds, but they still had their skin. They looked as if they were fighting and got cut down before that. I think they were fighting to defend the boss and went down almost simultaneously before the killer went to town on him." "The killer?" I asked, confused. "You think one man did this alone?" Patrick stated, dumbstruck. "I'm almost positive it was. But it was probably somebody who knew some art. That's what makes me think of that fellow. So you've seen nothing from him?" It was just then that the three reporters charged through the barricade with sketchpad and notebooks ready, thereby saving us from further deception. We quickly moved to begin intercepting the hungry jackals, but failure was already assured. However, Fell did get his photos, and we had a decent view of the scene before it was trampled. Later, as we sat at our club for lunch, Patrick gazed ashamedly at his bangers and mash. "It might have been Bleak, man. We let him get away. We've been letting him get away all week. I don't think it was him, Pat. But he knows the art, and he was involved with those things. And he had said he wanted out. We know he could do more than what he lets on. Maybe he conjured some devil to kill those men so he could get out. I don't know. He just didn't seem like that sort of bloke. Could have all been an act, pretending he's all respectful and afraid when he's some kind of murderous warlock. Look, I'm not saying it isn't possible, but my gut doesn't buy it. Let's go talk to him. He'll be at the library at this time of day before the gambling house opens. Let's go check out some books." Agreed. After a bite, we made our way towards the colleges, both knowing that we should have tried to rest before our next shift, but neither wanting to rest until our conscience was clean. Finding our way through the seemingly endless sea of books, we asked for directions to the occult sections and dark history. We could see the great stone tables, where only one lonely soul sat by the lamplight, surrounded by stacks of tomes. He did not notice us creeping closer, so engrossed was he in his studies. He scribbled relentlessly in a worn journal and almost leapt up and screamed, and when we sat down at his side and placed our hands on his shoulders to gently pull him back into his seat. "Great high spirits! What is wrong with you two?" "Eldon," Patrick spoke like an old acquaintance, patting Eldon on his back with a slight hint of intimidation. "We just wanted to talk to you." Bleak had the strangest look as he eased back down. Realizing now how sharp the young man's mind was, I was sure that his look was him quickly evaluating his options and systematically formulating a plan. Whether he was dangerous or not, we would have to handle him with great caution, or else he would slip away again. "It's okay, Eldon, you don't need to ready yourself to cast us asleep again. We just want to talk." I tried to sound sincere, but my humiliation was showing. You guys understand, right? Why I had to do that? I truly did not intend for there to be any bad air between us." "Bad air?" Patrick laughed. "No, not at all. I mean, we were almost convinced just to let you go, mate, but now that old Malmander's dead, it's got us wondering." Bleak's face grew pale, troubled and dark. I had nothing to do with that." "Well, then you must be quite grateful to whoever did, since now you're off the hook. Wasn't Malmander the one you owed all that money to? I mean, you never said the other night, but I've heard tell it was him." I watched him intently with every word Patrick spoke, determined to peer through his veil of friendliness and innocence and see what truth lay beneath. If this man was a killer, and more so, a very powerful art wielder, then I wanted to know. "I mean, that had to be the art, right, Eldon?" He turned and looked at me as I spoke. "A man can't do that kind of harm without someone else helping, don't you think?" "You're not wrong." His voice was low and quite serious. "But if you think I was involved, you're quite wrong, gentlemen. Admittedly, I will not be shedding any great amount of tears on Mr. Malmander's behalf. You are correct in your assumption that I was familiar with Malmander and his colleagues, but what befell those men was far outside the range of anything I am capable of doing magically or morally." "It seems strange, Mr. Bleak," I said as I turned and began to read through the titles of the books he had collected around him, with titles like Magi Egregious Notes and Phrases and Alchemical Symbols of the Silver Reed. "It seems strange that all of this has worked out so conveniently for you." "It's really not. A considerable portion of what I study is how to produce favorable results from the circumstances of life." "Right, favorable circumstances, like shredding some guy you owe money to into a pile of meat." I nudged him with my elbow and winked for emphasis. "No, like subtly bending events and outcomes in your favor. What you would call luck." He began to use his hands to further express his meanings when Patrick placed his hands firmly on Bleak's wrist. "I'm going to suggest that you refrain from too many gestures for the remainder of this conversation, Mr. Bleak." "Gentlemen, I was honest in my concern for your well-being. I truly meant you no harm." "So, if we had said that we were going to get into deep trouble, should you escape, then you wouldn't have used your little sleep charm. You wouldn't have tried to leave if it would have reflected poorly on us?" Patrick asked, with such a plain, sincere manner that I almost felt like he was truly wondering. Eldon then sighed and closed his eyes as if in deep concentration. I assumed as he tried to produce some deception that might still manage to endear him to us. It would have made it extremely unfavorable for me to still continue with that course of action. I very well might have attempted to concoct some other course altogether. But no, I still would not have wished to allow myself death or imprisonment. He looked from me to Patrick as if it was obvious and senseless to discuss. Well then, who, Mr. Bleak? I said. Who do you think might be responsible? If you have some time, I will show you, gentlemen. You two feel up to a bit of a walk. A walk to where exactly? I was thinking of the long night ahead of us on patrol and how exhausted I already felt. Down to the river, he answered, closing the notebook and returning his white feather quill to the inkwell. The river? Patrick looked dumbfounded. Whatever result he had anticipated from this meeting, it was not going that way. Bleak was gathering his things into a shoulder bag, and soon we were following him from the shelves of the library into the cold streets of the city. A light snow had started falling from the endless gray of the winter sky as he led us through the market, pausing only to buy a small, warm hand pie from a vendor. He caught our envious glance and smiled. Are you two hungry? Grab one. My treat. Those aren't cheap, Mr. Bleak. Perhaps you should spend your coin more wisely. I studied his reaction, and found only once more that he seemed somewhat amused. I'm touched that you would worry about my purse, Officer Valance, but I've had a good stretch of luck the past couple nights. I watched as he brought 2 of the steaming delicious pastries and passed them to us with the same confident smile. That's really what I would like you to understand about this whole business. I had no reason to wish harm on Malmander, as I had quite settled my debt, if you could believe it. I don't, Patrick mentioned bluntly as he took a bite from the pie. But thank you for the treat. The other night when I left your company, escaped, Patrick corrected. As you say, I had decided that I did not like the course I was taking with my life, and I needed a change. So you killed Malmander, Patrick once more finished, still finding Bleak unchallenged by this rudeness. No, but I did come to the realization that I was going to have to come to a conclusion on that subject, or else suffer the dark consequences. He was going to kill you. It was self-defense, I understand. Bleak shook his head thoughtfully and once more continued his walk through the market towards the river dock. No, Mr. Sistine, I have made up my mind to pay him his money. So I found a safe place to hide and devoted myself to the study of a certain type of charm which would bring me the money that I required to be rid of my debt to Malmander. Good luck, charms, I laughed, despite Patrick's stern, reprising look. I realized I was in the middle of his new interrogation. Yes, of a sense. As I mentioned earlier, there is a branch of art which specializes in such skills. Oh, so you're cheating at the clubs now? No, not really. I'm still playing the games, and there's always a chance I might lose. But I have amplified the positive energy around my person so as to preclude outcomes which are more in my favor financially. It was in this way that I was able to pay off Mr. Malmander. He actually parted on fairly decent terms. Excuse me if I don't just congratulate you on your turn of fortune. I studied Bleak intensely for any sign of deception, while being fully aware that he may be a tremendously skilled liar. However, I found myself, despite my misgivings, still feeling as I had with every interaction with him, that he may not be a strongly ethical person, but he seemed to be more or less truthful. I reminded myself through that this may well be an aspect of his art. I don't expect you to, either. Bleak turned down a side street from the square and took down the hill to the riverfront. But I am no killer. I actually abhor violence, and always seek to avoid it whenever possible. He was now leading us onto the wooden planks of the boat dock as the remaining river birds who had not left for the south flapped from various ropes and mooring posts. Now he bent down behind a stack of ice-covered crates and gestured for us to do the same. Crouching slightly behind the boxes, Bleak now pointed to the only craft sitting surrounded by ice at the far dock. It was a medium-sized, single-stack river steamboat sitting quietly as snow gathered on its roof and rails. There was the dim orange warm light visible through the windows, and occasionally there seemed to be movement inside. Do you know what that is, gentlemen? It's a steamboat stuck in the ice, I answered, curious as to what he was leading to. Yes, it is. That is the only steamboat to make it this far west in the past month from the frozen East River. His silvery eyes darted and met mine over his shoulder, as if there were something exciting about this. So? Patrick appeared bored. Whether for real or simply effect, I could not tell. River traffic has been utterly shut down for an enormous freeze that stretches all the way to the eastern highlands for weeks, guys. This time of year, the river is impassable and impossible, yet somehow, about 3 weeks ago, there was a sudden freak thaw that the river people have been discussing nonstop. It got warm for a few days, big deal. Patrick had brought forth his tobacco and began to deftly rolling, by all appearances without any interest in what was being said. Officer Sistine, it did not get that warm, but the river did indeed thaw just long enough for that little steamboat to make its way here from the far east. How far? I asked, unable to hide my growing curiosity. That boat traveled all the way from Val-Dremois Lake, I've heard tell. Ha! Patrick snorted. Rumor is just rumors. I'm telling you that there is a whole group of strangers on that boat that came all the way from the eastern highlands in the middle of the winter, and I guarantee you there is something supernatural involved. As he spoke, there was a sound of footsteps, and I watched as a form emerged from within the boat and began walking across the deck. As the shape came into the dim light of the winter day, my eyes widened with surprise. It was a small man with black hair and a great mustache, dressed more or less like a city man of some wealth, with a shining watch chain of silver shining from his waistcoat. This in itself was not unusual, if it were not for the man's skin. He appeared to have a green hue to his visible flesh, and a somewhat noticeable sharpness to his ears and features. Patrick snapped quickly out from his cocky display of disinterest. He's elf-blooded, Patrick whispered. Exactly. More so than anyone I've ever seen in this part of the world. Why is he green? Were the elves green? I couldn't take my eyes off the strange man. I didn't think that people were born with that much of the old blood anymore. They almost never are. Bleak was thoroughly delighted to have finally kindled our interest. Even in the East, where there are old families that claim a strong heritage to the ancient elves, usually they don't have a lot of the features. He's green because he's blooded by the river folk. They were green-skinned, but he's still quite large. What do you mean? He's a small man. No, I mean the elves were very small, much smaller than people realize. They were barely chest-high to most humans. They would almost look like a child to us. Well, granted that all of this is pretty unusual, but what does that have anything to do with you and Malmander? Patrick said this with a look to me, as if to reassure himself that he wasn't missing something. Malmander had said that he thought that that man and his people were following him around. What did they have in common? From what he said, nothing. But that man and the members of his crew have showed up in odd places all over the city. Malmander was convinced that they were stalking him. How many are on that boat? I was trying to gauge the size of the boat's interior. I'm not sure, but I've seen at least 4 or 5 others, men and women. Really? I tried to formulate some reason as to why a group like that would be on the river at this time of year, and somehow be associated with the late Malmander. Are they smugglers? I don't know, gentlemen, but I think perhaps you should consider other suspects than myself. He looked at Patrick with the same straight, matter-of-fact expression to which Patrick returned a suspicious grimace. We're not arresting you, Bleak. I don't know if it's because of your luck charms or not, but I don't think you killed Malmander. Patrick met my gaze and knew I agreed. Stay out of trouble. No more robberies. If you learn anything, then let us know, especially about this lot. What do you think, Tilly? Should we go talk to this newcomer? Strange boat in the winter is a good enough reason for the watch to stop by. I was just about to agree wholeheartedly when our silent reverie was shattered by the sound of footsteps in the snow as a shadow fell over us from behind the crates. Eldon shrieked like a cat with its tail stepped on and leapt up. I wheeled around to see 2 figures standing like dark silhouettes against the gray-white of the background. Patrick had almost drawn his sword when I heard the familiar click of 2 pistols being armed. My eyes focused on the largest of the 2, which stood closest and carried the long flintlocks, one in each hand. The figure towered over us as her cloak and scarves whipped in the wind. She wore a veiled violet hat, popular among the ladies of the city, which hid her actual visage, and in fact, all her clothing besides the white laces of her skirt and sleeves were dark purple. The smaller figure behind her seemed to be carrying packages, as if just returning from the market. "Why are you spying on our boat?" came a low, forceful, and distinctly feminine voice from behind the dark veil. All 3 of us struggled through our shock to create some intelligible communication, but it was the other who stood behind the giant who spoke first. "They're watchmen, Nannis. Don't shoot them," said the very small, older man with closely trimmed beard and hair as white as snow, which stuck to his shoulders. He stepped up beside her and gave her a gentle elbow nudge, yet still she did not lower her weapons. "Why is the watch skulking around the dock like hungry ship rats in the middle of the day?" I could hear the gentle, quiet snap of the giant hammers being lowered into place. "We had heard that a boat came upriver, and we didn't believe it." Patrick quickly offered an attempt to diffuse the woman's ire. "We were discussing how it was possible when you approached." "What is going on over there?" came the voice of the elf-blooded man who still stood on the boat. "It's us, Fisher. But we surprised some watchmen," answered the short, older man. "Did you now?" he shouted back, laughing, his voice clear and thick with an eastern accent. "Well, bring them over so that we may meet them. Or has Annis shot them already?" "Not yet," said the woman as she finally lowered the guns. I could not tell for sure, but I think she might have been smiling beneath the veil. Standing at her side as we walked around the stack, it was clear that she was a full head and shoulders taller than me, with my eyes meeting her great bosom, which would force me to crane my neck should I try to meet her gaze. The man was quite the opposite, and stood just shy of Eldon's shoulder, although he appeared quite stocky and carried the many packages in his arms with ease. Patrick, Eldon, and I all shared nervous glances with Eldon, particularly looking like he might flee. As we approached the dock, the green-skinned man had slid out onto a boarding ramp and was standing at the top with a look of interest and amusement. It was difficult not to stare, so unusual was his appearance. He had taken a long cigar from a case within his brown coat and deftly bit off the tip, slightly smiling. It was then I noticed, but I was not sure, but he appeared to have very sharp, white, pointed teeth as well, but his thick mustache hid his mouth. "Hello, sir," Patrick greeted the stranger, tipping his three-corner hat and bowing politely. No matter how much his surprise, Patrick would not succumb to base rudeness. He would be horrified should he think someone might tell one of his numerous younger siblings that he had possibly been impolite or ungentlemanly. "Hello, good sirs," the man replied, as he revealed a matchbox from his pocket. I glanced over at Eldon, who was effectively attempting to disappear with or without the benefit of art to help. "My name is Anton, but I am known mostly as Fisher for obvious reasons." This was met only with our ignorant silence, as we had no idea at what he alluded, until Eldon stepped forward and spoke briefly in a hoarse whisper, "Because he's descended from those known as Fisher Elves or river folk and bears a likeness to many of their qualities. I forget that we are foreigners and that such things are rare, if not completely unknown in these parts." As he spoke, he had struck a match and began to try and stoke his cigar, but the wind was unrelenting. "This young lady here is Anis Veccha, and the gentleman with the parcels is Debrius Kettleburn." "We do apologize," I stated, trying to salvage our image. "My name is Tillinassus Valence. My partner here is Patrick Sistine." Catching Eldon's desperate eyes, I withheld his name. "We were amazed to see a boat out here when we had thought the docks all empty, as I could imagine you would be. We are the beneficiaries of profound fortune recently. That warm spell gave us a rare window in which to travel this winter." He looked up and met our gaze with all integrity. "We were seeking to reach the city as soon as possible, and would have been stuck if it were not for such a blessed oddity of weather. May I ask why you wish to get here so soon?" I was trying to uphold our air of congeniality. "Certainly. I and my compatriots are members of an organization known as the Stoneland Metaphysical Society. I do not know if our reputation reaches as far to the west, but word of your city has indeed reached us in the east." "Really? For what?" "Why, your ghosts, of course," said the woman named Anis. Fisher nodded his agreement. "Word has it that the sight of specters has almost become a popular occurrence in your city." "I wouldn't say they were popular," Patrick said with a knowing smile. "I mean, it seems like my partner Tillinassus here cannot turn over a stone on the street without finding a ghost beneath it, but I think that might be peculiar to him." I shook my head in silent defiance. However, I could not in any honesty argue the comment. "You know, there are many places, entire communities, as a matter of fact, where it is debated whether ghosts even exist," the man named Debrius explained. "My homeland in the north, as a matter of fact." He said this with a sidelong glance at Eldon, which indicated he thought perhaps Eldon was as well. "I would find it difficult to ignore their presence, as they seem to pop up all the time." I said this with a certainty that the foreigners were making a joke of some sort. I found it exceedingly hard to imagine entire cultures simply not believing in spirits. "And that is exactly why we have come," Fisher stated with a certain light of interest sparkling in his dark green eyes. "We want to study the phenomenon in Dark Beach, and perhaps find an answer as to why the spirits are more prevalent and of greater awareness here. We've heard tell that many ghosts in the cities can be spoken to, with even by those not of paranormal inclination." "Well, of course," Patrick said with wonder as he too searched their faces for some sign of deception or humor. "Are you saying that elsewhere only some people can speak with them?" "Absolutely," Debrius answered. "Our society formed mostly based on the assemblage of numerous individuals who are considered mediums." "Ghosts are seldom seen, let alone spoken with," Anis added. Often they will manifest, but only through actions and events. If one is seen, then it is a very strong spirit indeed. Then we must have a considerable collection of powerful spirits here. Even as I said this, I found a strange emotion dawning in my person. And I always felt as if something was different here. Something was wrong. Well, welcome to Dark Beach, then. I hope you find the answers you're seeking. Patrick stepped back, and I took the hint that we were leaving. Excuse me, sir, Fisher said for the first time, directly addressing Eldon, who was already turning to leave. He stopped and turned slowly and cautiously as a child might addressing a particularly intimidating schoolmaster. I myself found that there was something about Mr. Fisher which reeked of authority, as if he was someone who either deserved respect or who was simply used to getting it. Yes, sir, Eldon almost stammered. I'm sorry, it's just that I haven't seen anyone else of elf blood, and I began to wonder if there were any. Oh, I'm not of the blood, sir, he answered awkwardly, which drew a look of astonishment on the stranger's face. Well, I'm very sorry then. I thought for sure you were possessed of many of the features. Now as he said it, I looked on Eldon with a new perspective. In comparing him to Fisher, I indeed counted a great many similarities. They shared a slight build and facial quality which now seemed obvious. I meant no offense. Please forgive my mistake. None taken, honestly. I suppose it's possible. I know nothing of my heritage since I was adopted from an orphanage when I was very small. I've always assumed a bit of a northern ancestry, but I never thought of elf blood. Well, no shame there, young man. I myself was an orphan. But I would just mention I am from a country where that heritage is quite common, and is held as a status symbol by the high class of society. I can say undoubtedly that you could say you have come from any of those families, and I would not have been surprised. I and Patrick looked at each other and silently both agreed to leave this new, strange conversation with these strange people immediately. I was floundering under the weight of too many revelations for a single afternoon. Eldon looked absolutely gobsmacked as Patrick turned and began to walk back across the dock. Good afternoon, I called, as I bid my retreat with a slight bow. It was truly a pleasure. All's as well, gentlemen, Fisher echoed with a slight wave. The other two said nothing, but a mutterance about putting down the parcels from the dark-dressed Debris. As we crossed the street back to the alley, headed towards the market, Patrick glanced behind us, as if suspicious we might be heard. That was bloody insane, he said, still almost whispering as if they might be able to hear. Agreed, I said, looking to Eldon, who still seemed to be trying to reclaim his mind from where it had drifted during the meeting. Eldon, mate, are you okay? Patrick said for the first time, showing unabashed sympathy for the until recent criminal, even slapping him on the back, as if he were a newborn he was trying to give his first breath. I suppose, Eldon mumbled. Am I elf-blooded? He asked of no one in particular. Don't give it another thought, I nudged him as we walked on through the still falling snow down the narrow, dark alley. He was trying to throw us off, I explained as Patrick hastily nodded in agreement. Exactly, he exclaimed. He knew what he was doing, that one. What do you mean? Eldon slowly began to recollect his composure. He knew how odd his whole story sounded. Everything about those folks was suspicious as a lead coin. They just casually explained that they came up river in midwinter on a steamboat during a freak thaw to investigate our city's ghost problem. Eldon continued to regain his senses. That's mad, he said with still growing awareness. If their little society was wanting to get to Dark Beach so badly, they could have taken the bloody train. They could have taken the train, Eldon repeated with new clarity. Why are they still staying on the boat? Patrick flourished wildly as they entered the market space, almost drawing looks. Why haven't they gone to an inn or a boarding house? I continued. They're on the run, Eldon gasped. Absolutely, Patrick snapped his fingers for effect. We're going to have to watch them. So, does that mean you're not going to arrest me? Eldon had that look again, and I truly wondered if this wasn't all part of his tricks or luck spells. We had confronted him today with the full intention of making him confess to being involved in murder. And here we were, walking along, feeling quite sorry for the fellow and wishing that he would buy us more pies. And he did. Not only did we not arrest Eldon that day, but that was when he unofficially became our consultant on matters of the supernatural. Over the coming months, he became an invaluable resource when we had found our investigations blocked and quieted by circumstance. So, as we walked quickly away from the terrifying specter of the priestess in the chapel at Plague Town, it was evident that his services would be necessary yet again.